In this lecture, we'll talk about bid rigging and how it is connected to the economics of auctions. Bidders can increase their profit by agreeing not to bid against one another, effectively reducing the level of competition. Such collusion or bid rigging is more likely to occur in open auctions and small frequent auctions. And if collusion is suspected, one, don't hold open auctions because everybody can see who is or isn't bidding and verify that. Do not hold small and frequent auctions because small frequent auctions are more susceptible to bid rigging. And do not disclose information to bidders. Don't announce who the winners are, who else may be bidding, or what the winning bids were. Let's suppose that we've got an oral auction with 5 bidders with values of $5, $4, $3, $2, and $1. And these dollars represent the top dollars that an individual is willing to pay. Now, without any sort of collusion or coordination among the buyers, in an oral auction of this nature, which is a second price auction, the winning bid is going to be about $4. Suppose, however, that in this auction, the 2 high-value bidders have formed a cartel or a bidding ring and agreed not to bid against each other. So this cartel can win the bid as long as they outbid the $3 buyer. In other words, they can win the bid at a price around $3 as opposed to the price of $4 that would obtain in a competitive setting. So the cartel makes a profit of $1, which would typically be evenly split among the cartel members. Bid rigging is a criminal violation in the United States and in many countries as well. In one type of bid rigging or another type or a variant of bid rigging, the cartel members will agree to re-auction the items actually in a second auction to cartel members, which is known as the knockout round or the knockout auction. The knockout auction, or the purpose of the knockout auction, is then to give the other cartel members the option to buy the item that's been obtained at the artificially low price in the first round. Another option is a bid rotation scheme in which it's sort of a quid pro quo bidding behavior. Each member of the cartel will either submit a weak bid or refrain from bidding in a particular round of the auction, and that way not bid against the other members in the cartel and wait their turn until it's their turn to win. So let's consider a couple propositions. One, that collusion is more likely in oral auctions, and in an oral auction, the cartel members can immediately determine any defection from the agreed upon outcome and punish the defector. So collusion is much easier to enforce in an oral setting. How about a sealed bid auction? In a sealed bid auction, collusion requires the coordination of all the cartel members, and that would then require some way to effectively operate in a coordinated, cooperative manner, analogous to say, the prisoner's dilemma, which gives us insight into that sort of situation. Collusion is also more likely in small, frequent auctions because this allows just a natural mechanism for the cartel members to spread the wins more frequently around. Here's an interesting graphic, and it's a graphic of the price of fish, frozen fish, which may not strike you as terribly interesting, but what's interesting about this picture is that the date here that's in late 1988 is a date that the U.S. Navy, a large consumer of frozen fish, identified or began to suspect that they were being the victims of a bid rigging scheme in which they were buying frozen fish at artificially high prices. In other words, they suspected that the suppliers of frozen fish to the U.S. Navy were coordinating and artificially inflating the prices that they were charging the Navy. In other words, giving bids that were too high and higher than they would have been had all of those frozen fish suppliers been operating independently. So what the investigators in this case actually did was a form of a backcast. It's like the opposite of a forecast, only backward looking. And they asked a what if question, or a what would have been question. What would have been the price that the Navy would have paid if full competition were present in the frozen fish market? And what they found, if you look to the left of the two vertical lines here in the graphic, what you see in the first part is two lines, the actual price that the Navy was paying, which was about $3.50 a pound, and very relatively flat, versus an estimated price, and the estimated price is what the price would have been but for the conspiracy or the collusion. And you can see that not only is that estimated price much lower, but it's also much more volatile, and that is consistent with what we see in competitive commodities markets. In contrast, then, if you look past those double vertical lines to the post period, so in between the vertical lines is the period where the conspiracy was brought to light and the competition in the market began to be enforced. You can see a very rapid convergence of the actual price to the competitive price. And then in the post-conspiracy period, where competitive pressures were actually operating in this market, you can see an almost one-for-one movement of the actual price and the competitive price. So this is a good illustration, or a natural illustration, of how collusion can increase the profitability of the suppliers in this case. But remember that to the extent that the firms are benefiting, the consumers, in this case the U.S. Navy, are paying a higher price. And so it's, in this case, was a criminal violation. Now, the government is actually a frequent victim of bid rigging, and so we can actually learn from the government's advice or experience in this case. So even there's a sliver of hope in the fact that the government is perhaps the frequent victim of bid rigging, because we can learn from their experience. And so some tips on how to avoid collusion, learning from the government's experience, would be: one, reward purchasing agents for making good decisions. So purchasing agents being those running the auctions, don't rely on agents, in other words, who have little or no interest in obtaining a low price, and incentivize the purchasing agent and connect their compensation to the competitiveness of the price that obtains. Don't entangle purchasing agents with masses of red tape. In other words, permit them to negotiate if possible, or bargain with the bidders if they suspect bid rigging. And then lastly, don't use the procurement process to further some type of social agenda. If possible, make the procurement process as competitive as possible and create a distinction between those two items. How is it possible, or what are some strategies to keep cartels in the dark and thereby make it more difficult for them to organize and coordinate and collude? One, don't hold open auctions. That makes it much more difficult to know who, if anyone, was defecting, and therefore harder to punish them. Don't hold small frequent auctions, which are inherently vulnerable to bid rigging and collusion, because they offer many small opportunities for the members of the cartel to take turns in bidding. And lastly, don't disclose information unless legally required to do so, of course, of who won the bid, what the winning bid was, or who the other bidders were, for that matter. So less information disclosure will make it more difficult for cartels to collude. In this lecture, we've discussed bid rigging. Thanks for listening.